Hi, my name is Mike Fox. I'm a legal fellow with the Cato Institute Project on Criminal Justice, and I'm joined today by Reason Magazine's Billy Binion, and we're here to discuss strategic misdirection, how distorted policing priorities leave violent crime unsolved. This is a particularly relevant issue today, as we've now seen the president use the federal government to take over Washington, D.C.'s police force and indiscriminately deploy federal agents across the district. We've also seen a number of other moves that the president has done recently, including taking ICE agents from their role of finding and deporting violent criminals to going after anyone who purports to speak Spanish or look like they might be an illegal immigrant. We now have FBI agents on random foot patrols in D.C. when they should be doing counterterrorism, counter-surveillance operations. We have DEA agents patrolling the National Mall, despite the fact that there is actually no crime that I'm aware of that even occurred on the National Mall. So this is a discussion not so much on the numbers of police officers, but on what they're doing and how what they're doing either does or does not result in clearance rates for violent crime. And violent crime, we mean things like murder, rape, carjacking, armed robbery, right? I think a lot of people think of crime as anything that's against the law. Crime really should be things that tear at the very fabric of civil society, that genuinely harm other people. It's not immoral behaviors that one of us may not like, whether I choose to smoke a joint, drink a beer. That really doesn't harm anyone else. If I go and hold a gun to someone's head and take their car, that does, and that's a distinction that I think is worth noting. Billy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that on the subject of D.C. Specifically, since that's kind of taking the debate by storm right now, I think it's very interesting. I read the federal order that was leaked to a journalist named Ken Klippenstein, and there is an emphasis in the order on protecting federal buildings and using law enforcement officers that are being deployed in D.C. to guard federal buildings. I, of course, do not endorse, vandalizing federal buildings, but there is really no evidence that there are crime hotspots in places like the National Mall, like you mentioned. All of those not all of them, but a lot of those crime hotspots are going to be across the river in the southeast quadrant of the city. So if the actual interest is in curbing crimes that, as you mentioned, really tear at the fabric of society, then you have to employ what's often called hotspot policing, that really zeroes in on areas where repeat offenders are violently violating other people's rights. And I'm not convinced that that's what this is. To me, it looks like political theater.
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree. And the only vandalism of public buildings in D.C. or federal buildings in D.C. that I'm aware of in recent times was the insurrection, and that was by, Trump supporters themselves. So if we're going to talk about violent crime, look, D.C.'s crime rates have gone down, right? As of many cities, we saw spikes in homicides and violent crimes across the country during the pandemic. We've now seen them go down. But while cities are always going to have some crime, it is important that we do everything we can to reduce it, right? One murder is one murder too many. One carjacking is one carjacking too many. I recall in January 2024, when I was living in Northeast DC, I had come home from walking my dog, and there was crime scene tape up. I found out that a man right on a corner that I frequent all the time in broad daylight was carjacked and gunned down. So then I started looking at clearance rates. Clearance rates aren't even conviction rates. They just mean an arrest was made. They don't mean that person was ever convicted of a crime. And if you look at 2024, the homicide clearance rate in D.C. is 60%. Armed robberies are 34%. Non-fatal shootings are just 31%. So that means in a non-fatal shooting, just 3 out of every 10 people three out of every 10 cases result in an arrest, let alone a conviction. And there are neighborhoods and cities across this country where that rate is closer to zero. And we know that the deterrence for violent crime is not the length of the sentence. It's the definitiveness of a sentence. It's the guarantee that you will be caught and you will be punished. And if we have instances where people know that if they commit violent crimes, nothing will happen, that really doesn't do anything to prevent crime from occurring. And Billy, as you noted, I don't think if the president had decided to employ, there's something called the Capital Region Fugitive Task Force, which is federal marshals. It's a group of D.C. police officers and other federal agency partners. If Trump had simply wanted to beef that up, I would support that, and I think most people would, because then they're going after people who are wanted for serious violent crimes. They're doing it in a strategic fashion. They're actually getting violent offenders off the streets. But putting random federal agents, having the FBI make traffic stops, which they're not even trained to do, really doesn't do that. And we actually saw a homicide last night in a wealthy area of D.C., and to my knowledge, no arrest was made.
Yeah, and I also think we need to make a distinction in this conversation. There's a lot of debate right now going on. People are pushing back on the notion that D.C. is at a 30-year violent crime low, which is true. The response being that, well, there is still, the homicide rate is still high in the context of other cities, which is also true. But I think that can be the case, while it also being the case that the solution in sending in the National Guard for 30 days isn't going to make a big difference. I think you can acknowledge the reality and it being unacceptable that any violent crime exists, while also wanting to find a solution that actually works, and this isn't that.
That's exactly right. And I've seen, you look at both sides. You have the left crowd of prison abolitionists, defund the police, and then you have the right crowd of MAGA, flood the city with federal agents and military troops. Both of those are objectively unreasonable, right? If you go, and I've been a public defender in a poor city, if you go and talk to most of the people that live in these communities, they don't support either one of those fringe things. They want police in their communities, but they want police who are partners with them, who are working with them to solve violent crimes. They don't want police who are stopping their brothers and sisters and mothers and daughters over absolute nonsense. That undermines public trust, and that is the reason why people won't report crime. They won't come forward to testify against violent offenders. And what I don't know and would like to know, but the information doesn't appear to exist, is, there's been a lot of discourse in D.C.'s criminal justice reform laws about, what the appropriate maximum sentences should be. But the reality is not only are a lot of these crimes going unsolved, but the overwhelming majority of convictions result from guilty pleas. And that is despite the fact that the criminal jury trial is the only right that appears in both the unamended text of the Constitution in Article 3 and the Sixth Amendment. So you have a system where highly coercive plea bargaining displaced jury trials, and you may have prosecutors offering generous pleas to lessers because they either don't know how to try cases, they're afraid of juries, they've violated people's rights and don't want to get caught. Frankly, I don't know because the data doesn't exist for us to know. But I can say more broadly, 98.3% of criminal cases in the federal system result from plea bargains, and these are questions that need to be had. But leadership starts at the top, and having a U.S. attorney who is a talk show host who really hasn't prosecuted cases in years, or having someone before her who spent more of his time going after political officials for criticizing the president, really doesn't instill confidence in most people that they're actually serious about solving violent crime.
Yeah, and I think the broader debate low clearance rates are not unique to D.C. Across the country, I think for violent offenses, it's basically a coin flip. If you murder someone, it's a coin toss on if you will be caught and arrested. And as you mentioned, it doesn't even mean they caught the right person. It just means a clearance rate, meaning that they caught someone. We talked a little bit about this, and there's a broader debate about the idea versus under-policing and over-policing. Police officers being dispatched to crime-ridden communities and focusing on offenses that are kind of easy to check a box, drug offenses, that sort of thing. And not focusing their resources, diverting their resources onto things like violent offenses. Also, things like sex crimes. That's more like a 30% clearance rate, which is terrible. I think most people, if you polled them, I hope most people would say that they would want people focusing on things like rape and murder. But those take more resources, longer time, and not the quick, the quick clearance that some of these lesser offenses generate. And I also think that focusing on those offenses and over-policing those offenses destroys trust in communities that, a lot of, when you look at the data and drill down into the data, it's really interesting. Actually, the majority of black people, they want to maintain or increase police presence and spending, but they're also way disproportionately afraid of police and distrustful of them. And that's an interesting contradiction that I think a lot of communities don't really know how to grapple with, because they deal with crime disproportionately, but they also disproportionately deal with the fear of bad police run-ins and the trust that destroys. So it's a balancing act, and I think that you see that it doesn't produce the best results long-term for these communities.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think it's also worth discussing that, when it comes to holding police accountable, right? In theory, there are ways, right? Officers can be charged with a crime. That almost never happens, right? Officers can also be subject to internal discipline. That also never happens. Their unions are immensely powerful, and they have, all sorts of laws that work in their favor. Some states have police bill of rights that requires a certain amount of time before the officers can even be questioned after they use force. And then, of course, you have a civil remedy. And we're talking about for state and local police. I can get into federal in a moment. But for state and local police, there's a statute called Section 1983 that was passed in 1871. It was passed after slaves were freed in the South, and Southern states were not allowing them to exercise rights that the Constitution conferred upon them. So this statute created a way for them to go into federal court and get a federal judge to order the states to back off. And it worked, for about 100 years. Granted, there weren't a whole lot of lawsuits that were brought under it. Once there were, during the Civil Rights Movement, we suddenly saw the Supreme Court invent this doctrine called qualified immunity out of whole cloth. And in the years since, about the 5 decades since, it's gotten so convoluted and so complex that unless the same case happened in the same jurisdiction where a judge said that the conduct was unconstitutional, you really don't have a remedy. And that's for state and local. For federal officials, it's even worse because you don't even have a way to sue. You have a Supreme Court case called Bivens that created an implied right of action, but that's been narrowed and constricted, and there's a conservative majority that seems to want to get rid of it entirely.
It basically doesn't exist anymore.
Right, it doesn't exist anymore. So really the solution to a lot of these problems is that Congress needs to legislate. Congress needs to get rid of immunity for prosecutors as well. Prosecutors have even worse. They have absolute immunity. They cannot be sued at all for anything they do in their prosecutorial capacity. They need to get rid of qualified immunity, and they need to codify Bivens so that if you have the FBI playing local cops and they violate your rights, you have a way to sue them. And you have a way to get into court.
Right, and I think that the lack of that ability for victims to have, because it's not even really about accountability at this point. The taxpayers are paying these settlements, but I think that if we're talking about destroying trust, if you are a victim of someone who's supposed to enforce the law and you're reminded that they're above it, I don't see how that is healthy for a society. I mean, qualified immunity I've covered for a long time, and it protects cartoonishly corrupt behavior. Police being told they can't be sued for stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars because there's no court precedent that says stealing under certain circumstances is illegal. I mean, it just holds the most powerful people in society to the absolute lowest standard, which I just think is very unhealthy.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I guess, to talk about what the path forward could look like, I think, we mentioned part of it, which is you get rid of these immunity doctrines, create a statutory right of action to sue federal officials. But as far as, police on the ground, we need to make sure that police, are actually connecting with the communities that they serve. In the old days, we'd have beat cops. Cops would go into businesses. They'd be friends with people. They'd go and ask if people saw suspects for violent crimes. They could count on their neighbors and people to come in and testify against people. But as we've seen the Supreme Court placate to police unions and issue these decisions that give law enforcement unfettered discretion to stop people over conduct that is not even morally wrongful in the sense that it genuinely harms others, that trust is eroded. So where do we go from here? I think a lot of it is really deciding what we do and don't want cops doing, right? I think we need police. They serve a vital purpose. They're important, right? They need our support, but they should only be doing things that actually are an affront to civil society, prosecuting people for robbery, for burglary. For one, if someone's drinking in a public park, I don't really care, right? That's not something that I really want the government coming down upon. And we can get into these tough discussions, like how do you handle someone who jumps a turnstile on the subway, right? On the one hand, that's theft of services. It's a crime. But on the other hand, if we're approaching this from a conservative standpoint, do you really want to spend tens of thousands of dollars to recoup a $2 subway fare? And of course, from a civil rights perspective, you're locking a human being in a cage. And these are conversations that we need to have, and they're conversations that we can't have because both sides of the aisle are so, corrupted by special interests and really unwilling to actually solve serious problems.
Yeah, and I would say if we're talking about a way forward, I think the conversation should be two-pronged. One of it is resource-based. So, there's a lot of data that show that an increased law enforcement presence deters crime, which I think comports with basic reality because people see police around and they don't want to be punished. But I think if you're going to increase law enforcement presence, which I'm not inherently opposed to, you have to make sure that their resources are being actually diverted towards these offenses that we're talking about, which actually matter and actually harm people and violate other people's rights. And I think that's really the most important thing. I think the second thing, which is also very important, is that a lot of this is for lawmakers as well. When people talk about passing new laws, I think that you have to have a really serious conversation. Where it's like if you're going to make a new criminal offense or you're going to talk about enforcing criminal offenses and you're going to put it in statute, you have to be very comfortable with someone enforcing that at gunpoint. And I don't think that we think about that seriously in a lot of these ways. For a lot of these offenses, it's a very grave thing to make something a criminal offense because you're saying it's worth sending not only taxpayer dollars after, but people with guns, and that requires a lot of. It should be a serious thing to do something like that.
I agree. And I'd add, police training too. Like, I am not one of those people who thinks that, police training is insufficient. They need more training. That's going to solve the problem. I will say, though, we do train police officers to go to war with their communities, and we should not be doing that, right? Officers should be integrated in the communities.
Right.
They should be valued members.
Riding in on tanks and stuff like that.
Right. When they should not be treating every mundane interaction as if it's a threat. And we've seen this, right? We actually saw a case that went to the Supreme Court last term, Barnes v. Felix, where the officer himself created the danger. This case involved a gentleman who was stopped for unpaid toll violations on his girlfriend's rental car. And of course, what do you know? The jurisdiction, Harris County, Texas, was actually benefiting from the unpaid toll violations. So there's this perverse incentive for the officers to make these stops. Mr. Barnes, who was the driver, got a little bit scared and nervous when the officer asked him to pop his trunk. He started to drive off. Meanwhile, Constable Felix jumped onto the side of the car and fired 2 rounds point blank, striking Mr. Barnes in the head. The problem here is that Mr. Barnes never actually posed a danger to Deputy Felix. It was the deputy's actions that created or invited the danger. And we've seen this happen repeatedly. It happens a lot with people exercising Second Amendment rights. There's been a series of instances where law enforcement has raided the wrong house, and if you happen to be a gun owner and happen to open the door with your gun, as a reasonable person might, if someone takes their door down at 3 o'clock in the morning and doesn't identify themselves, you're likely going to die, right? And that is the type of thing that, because you exercise the constitutional right, you're putting your life on the line by officers who cannot and will not be held accountable, and that needs to stop.
Right. Not only might you die, but I mean, in the case, if you strike a police officer, I covered a case from a defendant named Martin Guy, who's now spending the rest of his life in prison because when he was subject to a no-knock raid, he says he thought that they were intruders, which, is perfectly plausible because you wake up, it's like, they do it in the dead of night, you're surprised, you think that someone is breaking into your home, and he's now serving life without parole. So that is a real something that happens, and it's not something that's an isolated instance. I also will say, when we're talking about crime, especially in urban areas, there is somewhat of a, it's not just progressive these days, but it was typically the progressive response that we just need to get rid of guns. I personally am not a big fan of gun culture myself. I don't own a gun, but you have a constitutional right to do so, and so I do think these conversations need to be based in that reality that you have a right to own a gun, and oftentimes efforts to criminalize that really do sweep up people who maybe not have been able to afford a license but are carrying for protection in high crime areas, and I think that is an injustice that often flies under the radar and should not.
Yeah, and going off the gun point, there are a lot of places in D.C. that you can't carry, and I noticed since they started doing this, federal task force initiative in D.C., there's a number of people who've been charged with unlicensed possession of a firearm. That it is very difficult to get a license, and even when you do, there are most places in the district that you can't carry in. Now, we can debate. Some of those I think are legitimate, some of them I think are not, but is the mere possession of a firearm that you have a constitutional right to possess, should that be a crime absent anything else? I don't think so, right? So we're going after all these people who've done heinous things, but they really haven't. I mean, obviously, if you have a stolen firearm or defaced firearm, different story, but simply carrying a gun, look, if you live in a high crime city, if I had the ability to carry everywhere I walked in DC, I would absolutely do so. I don't because I can't. It's against the law, right? So that is something that we ought to talk about. And it's also worth noting that, crime exists in blue cities. It exists in red cities. We have, high crimes in New Orleans, which is, Louisiana as red as it gets. Memphis as red as it gets. We have a lot of crime in Chicago as blue as it gets.
Mississippi
DC
is
as blue
very
as it gets.
crime-ridden.
Right. Jackson, Mississippi is one of the highest crime cities in the country. Yeah, it's a very red state, right? So some of these states, you could get constitutional carry. You could walk into a store, walk out with a gun. Other cities like Chicago, it's almost impossible to even get a gun. And yet, so what we're seeing that these laws don't work because guess what? Criminals don't follow the law. You think drug prohibition works? If drug prohibition worked, guess what wouldn't be happening? There wouldn't be drugs and there wouldn't be rampant overdoses.
Right. And I think that one of the things that is a moral argument is talking about guns. A lot of these licensing regimes are very expensive, they're very time-consuming, and I don't want self-defense to only be something available to people of a certain class, socioeconomic status. I think you prosecute the action and the behavior, not a paperwork violation.
Yeah, no, I agree, and that's exactly. I don't remember all the details on this, but I believe there's maybe like one gun store in DC that you could buy at or something. Don't quote me on that, but something like that, right?
Right, and you can have an issue with the law, but it is the law. I mean, the Supreme Court decided Heller and Bruin and said you have a right to have a personal handgun outside of your house. That is the law. So we have to. These licensing regimes need to operate within that, no matter how much it bothers people.
No, that's exactly right. And I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of these restrictive laws give police a license to stop people, right?
Totally.
That was, New York City's stop and frisk for years was predicated, it was pre-Bruin, was predicated upon officers alleging that people had guns on them. Were some of them criminals that belong behind bars? Yeah, absolutely, but many weren't. Many were just decent people trying to make sure that their kids were safe and that they were safe. So, I think, to sum things up, the role of police is to protect society, right? Even though police actually don't have an obligation to protect you, we hope that they will do that. And their job is to solve violent crime, right? It shouldn't be to police every behavior that you do that some person in power might not like. Billy and I might disagree on some moral things. I don't know. Maybe we probably don't, but let's say we do. That doesn't mean that I should be able to lock him in a cage for things that he does that I disagree with, or vice versa, right? That's not a legitimate use of government power, and I think it's time that our courts and our legislatures start putting an end to that.
Amen.